So let's talk briefly about texturing, how to create your own materials, how to find materials online and add them realistic looking materials to your scene. Because a lot of times when you're working on projects, you're going to be finding materials online and bringing them into Blender to texture your objects. So this is a new Blender project. Let's just go to the shading tab. So go up here and click shading in the shader editor. Now let's drag this up. Let's drag this down a bit. Then scroll on your mouse forward and backward so you can zoom in and out of this shader editor. So let's collapse this tab here. Just bring your mouse until you see this double-sided arrow. Right click and join areas. So it's checking whether you want to join to the right or join to the left. So just bring your mouse to the left and click. So you would extend this view. So this is basically your 3D view that you're used to, that you can move around in. And this is now your shader editor, where you create your materials, where you texture your objects, basically where you preview the look of what you're creating. So these are nodes, and this can get super complex, but we don't want to talk about super complex things in this course. I'm just trying to break it down in a very understandable way for someone that has never used Blender before. So these are two different nodes. Now remember we talked about materials. So if I click on this cube and I come here to this material properties, remember I talked about materials here, where you can change the color, where you can make it metallic, you can increase the metallic roughness and all that. Now you will notice something. As I'm changing things over here, it's also changing here. As I'm increasing the metallic, the roughness is also affecting it here. So this is a replica of this, or should I say this is a replica of this. So it's exactly the same thing. You can either stay in your layout tab and making changes here, or you can go into the shading tab and do everything in the node. So it's not super complex. This node is the same thing you are seeing here. So material output node is basically the output of the material you are trying to create. So whatever you put on the left side and you connect to the surface is what you are going to see. Now principal BSDF is called the shader. It's basically the construct or the algorithm or the template that Blender is using to create your materials for you. So let's just click on it and hit X to delete. X to delete. Now it seems like our cube has disappeared, but if we go to the solid view, our cube is still there. Our cube is still there, right? But if we go to the material view, it looks like the cube is no longer there because it has no material. It's not bouncing lights. Like it has no texture. It's pretty much invisible at this point. So let's hit Shift A now in the shader editor. Shift A and type diffuse. Diffuse BSDF is a shader. Remember, the shader is basically the construct that tells Blender what your object should look like. So now that you have added this diffuse node, connect the BSDF to surface. And now you have our cube back. So a diffuse BSDF is like the simplest version that you could use. You could see the principal BSDF had a lot of things you could change, but with diffuse you just have color and roughness. Let's say we click on the color and change it to something bluish. Yeah, now you can see we have a simple blue cube, right? So most of the time you wouldn't even be using the diffuse shader, but I'm just using it to explain the entire concept of shaders to you. So this is something you would use for objects that are not reflective. Like you can see this box is looking like a non-reflective shoebox. But if I click on the diffuse and delete it, and then Shift A again, and this time let's add a glossy BSDF. Now if I connect this to surface, you would see now we have a kind of reflective material. So let's also make this blue. Click the blue color here, and then let's reduce the roughness. Now you can see it's a very shiny material. It's looking like glass. So let's come down again and increase the roughness. Now you have that diffuse material look. So those are the basic things you need to know. Apart from color and roughness, there's also anisotropy, rotation, normal, tangents, displacement, volume, but we don't need to get into all that for this course. So now that you understand that a diffuse material usually looks rough and dull, and a glossy material is used when you want to have shiny looking objects. There are a lot of different other shaders. If I delete this one and I add a glass shader, for example, a glass BSDF, and I connect this to surface, as you can see, it's a glass material. It looks pretty much like glass. It is very reflective. It looks like if this drops, it's gonna break. And you can also mess with the roughness, so it's more like a rough glass that is not super transparent. And then when you bring the roughness to 0, it's a very glossy looking glass material. Now let's delete this glass BSDF and Shift A and add the principal BSDF. And connect BSDF to surface. Remember, this is your material output. This is what Blender sees. Now, this is the one you are used to. This is the one that Blender gives you by default. So we have talked about a couple things here. Changing the color. Let's say we change it to a pink color. We can also mess with metallic to make it more metallic looking. We can also mess with the roughness to make it shiny or to make it dull. Those are the key things. Now there is something called PBR materials, which stands for physically based rendering, which basically takes textures from actual real world surfaces and gives them to you so you can use it in Blender. Now a PBR material usually contains different images. Now it can contain an image for the base color, which is also called albedo. It can contain an image for metallic and the roughness. So instead of you setting actual values like 1, 2, 0.5, all that, these images will tell Blender where it's going to be metallic and where it's not, where it's going to be rough and where it's not. And then finally, normal. How can I describe normal? Normal is basically the bump you have on a material. So if you see a material of the road, for example, the normal will basically tell Blender where the bumps are. So if it's a rough road with cracks, the normal image is going to tell Blender where those bumps are meant to be. If it's a brick texture, you know, this box is a flat plane. It's just flat on all sides. And if I put a brick texture on this, it's going to look like a flat plane with a brick image printed on it. But if you want to see the details, you want to see the bulges, that's where you need the normal map. So let me just show you a real example of this. Let's go back to our browser, and this time let's search for CG Bookcase instead of CG Trader. This is one of my favorite websites for finding textures. There are a bunch of them, but let's just use this for an example. So you can see there are a lot of categories here. You can have bark, concrete, fabric, floor, wood, different types of materials, different types of textures for different surfaces. You can see granite, there is marble, different types. So let's say we want a brick wall. You want this cube to basically be a brick wall on all sides. Now let's come here, let's find one that we like. Let's say they all look very similar. Why am I finding it hard to pick one? Let's take this one, yeah, brick wall 24. So by default, it chooses the metalness roughness workflow because, you know, you have your metallic here, you have your roughness here. So those are the details that you would need in your Blender software. And also resolution. So you have 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K. So depending on how close this object is meant to be to the camera. So if you have an object that is super close in a close-up where you are going to see details on the object, it's best to have a very high resolution for that object. But in VFX, when you are creating materials for the floor or the walls for shadow catchers, you don't need it to be high resolution. But the object itself, the product itself, or whatever you are showing in the video should have good enough resolution. So for this example, let's download the 2K. Select 2K and hit download. So I'm going to take you through the entire process of downloading this and applying it to your object in Blender. So let's scroll down here. You can see this is what the material will look like. They showed us here. This is what it looks like on a sphere. You can come down, you can see you have a bunch of images here. So there is the base color, there is the height, there is the normal, there is the roughness, ambient occlusion. So you can use every single one of these, or you can use just the ones you want. I will show you in a bit. Now you can see in my downloads folder, there is a zip file called brickwall24. So let's extract it, right click and extract. And now we have an extracted folder with all the images that we talked about. So apart from just using the color here to change the color, we can hit Shift A and add an image texture. So image texture, and connect this to your base color instead. Now it looks black because there is nothing here, but when we click open, we can basically select any image we have on our folder and it will basically show up. Yeah, now our cube is wrapped with the image you selected, but then it looks kind of weird. So there's something called UV unwrapping. You don't need to get super complex with UV unwrapping, especially if you're working with characters. UV unwrapping can be a headache, but then the entire concept is basically taking your 3D model and telling Blender how to place the image texture. So if we go into edit mode, remember hitting tab and we hit U on our keyboard, you would see this unwrap here. So if you hit unwrap, it's going to basically take your 3D model and break it up into a flat plane. So you can also see different options when you hit U. You can see smart UV project. You can see cube, projection, cylinder, sphere, project from view. Let's click cube projection. So this one was specifically made for cubes. So if you have a cylinder, you can pick cylinder projection. So now there's a reason why I didn't collapse this side of our setup. So this is currently an image viewer where you can click on this drop down and select whatever image you are currently working with, but we are not doing that here. We need to go here and change it from image editor to UV editor. Now when we go into edit mode, when we come back here and go into edit mode, now you can see there is a cube here. You can see different vertices, and the thing with Blender is the shortcuts we talk about, the GR and the scale, GRS, can be used anywhere here. So if I click on this principal BSDF, I could use G to move it around. And same thing here. You can see different vertices on top of the image. You can use G to move it around, and you can see it's affecting the actual image. So basically each of these faces and each of these vertices are shown on this image right here. So if I hit A to select all, let's go to face select. Now if I select this face here in my 3D viewport and I hit A on the UV editor, you can see that this square here is the same square of my face here. So I can hit S on the UV editor and scale it up and down. You can see it's affecting the image. I can hit R and rotate the image up and down. This square is basically a representation of this face on my cube. And I can scale it up, I can rotate it, I can move it around. So if I want it to be closer to our face, I can scale it down and you can see just our face. So let's go out of edit mode. So that is how you basically add images to a scene. So for these images we downloaded, you can either add them one by one or you can use the Node Wrangler add-on. So let me just show you how to add them one by one. First of all, if we take this base color and drop it in Blender, this is now an image texture, just like the one we added. Now take color and bring it to base color, and you'll see you now have the texture of the bricks on your cube. But it looks very flat. It doesn't look like brick, yeah? It looks super flat. In fact, it looks like a shiny object because our roughness is low. So it's basically just taking just the image of the base color and setting the brick to that color. So the rest of these parameters, you can change them however you like. You can bring down the metallic. It's still going to be shiny. You can bring down the roughness to be super shiny. It's basically reflective, which does not happen with brick. You can bring up the roughness so it's more like a dull material, which is typical for brick. So instead of messing with values here, we can now add the images that maps to the exact value. Remember, we had a base color image and we have a roughness image. So if I take this roughness image and I drop it here and I connect the color to roughness, the next thing you need to do is to change this color space from sRGB to non-color, because you don't need the color data. Basically what you need to remember is only your base color most of the time needs color data. You can see this image texture is set to sRGB. Now this one, everything should be set to non-color. So we have the roughness of the image. You can see it's no longer shiny. It's now just the way it should look like. Let's drag this here. Now we don't have a metallic here because it's not a metallic object. But we have normal. Let's copy the normal image and drop it here. Now you can see there is a normal node here, and you might assume, oh, since this is a normal image, let's just connect it directly to the normal node. But no, you shouldn't do that. You should add something in between called a normal map. So if we hit Shift A again and click on normal, select normal map. As you can see, for the input of the normal map, we have color on this side and we have normal on this side. So what does that tell you? That since this image has color on this side, we can connect color to color. And since this shader has normal on this side, we can connect normal to normal. So if I zoom in here, you can see what the normal has done. It has given it some details. So if I disconnect the normal here, you can see how flat it looks. When I connect it, you can see. So it's adding details in between the bricks. And you can mess with the strength. You can bring it out to 0, where you basically see no bump. And you can increase it to 1 or even more than 1. But let's just keep it at 1. Yeah. Now, which one have we not used? We have not used height and we have not used AO. AO stands for ambient occlusion. So we don't need to use height if we have normal. We can only use one or the other. There is no point using both of them. Height does the same thing. It possesses the same information to give you some detail in your model. So let's pick the AO, ambient occlusion. Let's bring it here. To use ambient occlusion, let's Shift A and mix color. This is the node that basically mixes two colors together. So let's just drop it on top here. You can see if I take it on top of this line, it just connects automatically. So let's bring this ambient occlusion to B. So this A and B basically joins these two images together, and this factor shows you which one has more influence. So if I bring it down to 0, this A color has more influence. It's now 100% this color. If I move it down to 1, it's now 100% this ambient occlusion. But that's not what we want. We want them to mix, but we don't want them to mix normally. So to get the effect we're looking for, let's click on this mix drop down and change it to multiply. So we don't want it to mix those two colors together, but you want to see the effect of the ambient occlusion. You can see it here. If I disconnect the ambient occlusion, you can see it looks good, but then there are still some details that are lacking in between the bricks. If I connect them back, you can see we have those details. You can see the difference. There's a world of difference. This looks like professional work versus if you just do something like this. So this is basically how you set up a physically based render node. So let's select everything here and delete it. So let me show you the simple way to do this. So this is where we started from. So let's click on our principal BSDF, Control Shift T. Make sure you have Node Wrangler enabled. We already talked about this in a previous lesson. Now you basically need to navigate to the folder where you downloaded your textures, then select everything. Just click and drag, then hit Principal Texture Setup. And now Blender just does everything for you. Like everything we have been doing so far, it just does it automatically for you. But then you can make some adjustments. For example, you don't need displacement. You can either use displacement or you can use normal map. So I wouldn't suggest you use both. So you can see it looks super detailed, but you can mess with the strength. For example, the scale of the displacement, you can bring it down to 0. Now it looks super flat. 1, very detailed. Let's bring it somewhere like whatever looks realistic. So I think 0.4 is nice. Yeah, this looks like a very quality texturing of this cube. And you see it did everything for you. You already made this non-color. You already did the entire setup for you, and it also added these nodes here, the mapping nodes. So what this mapping nodes does is basically help you make adjustments. So if I click on X location, it's going to move the texture around. So you're basically mapping where the texture is. Z doesn't work because the texture is a two-dimensional image. So if you mess with X and you mess with Y, you're moving the texture around. You can also rotate. So let's rotate on the Z axis. You can see it's basically bending at an angle. Let me undo that. And also you can scale it up. So if you want it to be larger bricks, just click. Don't release your mouse when you click on X, then drag down. Don't release your mouse, then drag it to the side. Now you can see we have tiny little bricks. Then if we do the same thing, click, drag down and drag it to the left, we have huge bricks. We can have okay, make sure it doesn't go past 0, something like 0.2, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. We have super huge bricks. So when this scale is 1, it's the normal size. So depending on what you're trying to create. So these are basically things you do when you're texturing. And you can apply the same texture to any object. So if we hit Shift A and add a sphere, for example, UV sphere. Let's bring it GX. Now we have our UV sphere. Let's click here. Let's rename this material to brick. Now let's click on the sphere, click on the drop down and select the brick. Now we can apply this material to any object we have in our scene. And when we click this 2 here, or this duplicate here, we create an extra version of the object. So when we click on the cube, we have brick. When we click on the sphere, we have brick 1. So when we make changes to the sphere, it's not going to affect the cube. So that's basically how you do that for different materials. Also, we can add some details to the cube itself. Let's go back to our layout. Go to the cube, go to our material preview. Now let's add a modifier bevel, generate bevel. Now this does something weird. Let's increase the segments. So this basically creates smoothness around. Let's go to solid view so you see what I'm saying. Yeah, this basically, if I mess with these segments, you can see basically makes the edges to be curved, to be smooth. if I drag the amount down, you can see it gets sharper and it gets smoother. So let's do something like this, because in real life there is no edge. If you look around, there is no edge that is truly sharp. Around my phone, it is not really sharp. It's always curvy. There is no truly sharp edge. Even a knife, if you zoom in with a microscope, you can see it's actually not sharp, like 90 degrees sharp. So it's kind of curvy. So let's right click and hit shade smooth. So it looks very nice and smooth. So if we go to the material view, you can see I'll have a nice looking wall or a nice looking brick block. So that's it for the basics of texturing. This is basically what you'll be doing most of the time when you are downloading models or creating your own models. You're basically taking physically based textures and you're adding it to your models. So there are a bunch of other things you could do, but over time as we go through the course, we'll touch on those other things. So this is basically it for texturing. Next, we're going to talk about some animation principles.